Okay, after hopefully a good lunch and a very, very stimulating session this morning, warm welcome back to this afternoon. Up until tea, which is at 3 o'clock, this is a two-part session. First of all, I'm delighted to welcome J P Rangaswami, who will be talking to us for about 30 to 40 minutes with time for questions. And then after that, we're going to move on to a panel discussion on AI and future society. So first of all, I would very much like to welcome and thank J P Rangaswami for agreeing to come and talk to us this afternoon. For those of you who don't know, JP is an independent non-executive director of Daily Mail and the General Trust plc since February the 7th, I have been given a lot of detail, 2018, with extensive knowledge and experience in the fields of data and computer science. He served as Chief Data Officer of Deutsche Bank since 2015 until 2018, and was Head of Innovation there until September 2018. He's an adjunct professor here in electronics and computer science and a charter member of TIE, the Early Stage Networking and Mentoring Group, and he's also an advisory board member of CALIT. He's a fellow of the British Computer Society and of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, Manufactures and Commerce. He holds a degree in economics and statistics from St Xavier's College, University of Calcutta. So I'm going to hand over to you, JP. And JP's told me he wants to speak to us for about half an hour, and then we'll move for a few questions after that. So thank you very much indeed.
Good afternoon. I was really happy that I came here early enough to listen to Susan in the earlier session, because it helped set the context for what I wanted to say much more clearly. First and foremost, my interest in websites has always been because using scientific methods and being data-driven in some of the things that we do, but doing it in a way that takes accountability and responsibility for the social and political and environmental context is becoming more and more important. And I didn't see that any of the problems we face in this world could be solved without that. Yet at the same time, I was principally in industry. You know, I used to be chief scientist at BT, I was chief scientist at Salesforce. I tended to work in institutions that have tens of thousands of people and sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, but in a context where people used to separate academia from industry, from government, from the world at large, as if these were independent silos. And it always frustrated me that that kind of framing took place. So when I was asked whether I'd speak here, part of what I wanted to get through was saying, how does industry fit into this context that you guys have been talking about, researching, learning? Should it fit in at all? If so, what can the flow of information, knowledge, tools, techniques, how can the two help each other? And my starting assumption is yes, it can, because otherwise I wouldn't be here. But it starts with something that Susan mentioned in her talk, to do with this growing sort of populism that is affecting us in many parts of the world. You know, it's not restricted to the UK and Brexit, or for that matter to the US and Trump or whatever. We see generally that there are populist moves in many parts of the world. And I was trying to unpack that and say, if I look at it from an industry context, as firms, I mean, because the concept of the firm, rather than being a relatively, tiny mom and pop store kind of business, is itself something that's relatively new, okay? 150 years perhaps. The nature of business and creating firms and started with some post-industrial revolution promises to turn around and say that you aggregate in order to reduce transaction costs, to be able to get economies of scale and scope. You provide security of tenure as a magnet to be able to bring employees in, and then you retain through having something that looked like a promise of benefits. And somewhere around all that, you attach some ability to gain access to capital at scale, and then to be able to deploy that capital. Well, in most cases, individual credit ratings are better than industrial credit ratings. The web has changed distribution and access rights. So, there is still a lot of barriers that have been removed, even though some remain. The concept of security of tenure isn't there. I could speak 10 years ago and say my dad had one job. By the time I die, I'd have 7. My children will probably have 7 jobs at the same time. So we've seen changes in the form of what employment looks like. And most institutions would probably prefer that I'd never mentioned the promise of benefits again. So you put that together, and so the firm has been changing. Well, what does that firm look like today, and how does that relate to sort of where we're going and why I thought it was important in a web science and data science context? I wanted to concentrate on this populism and say, I'll talk about activism. Right? The earliest activism that took place in an industrial context was government or state, to turn around and say there are rules and regulations as to how you should behave, monopolies, restricted trade, market abuse. So there were attempts to constrain the behavior of an institution by having some kind of focus on the public good and saying there are ways a firm should behave or not behave. By the 60s, that had been augmented by saying, a Ralph Nader type consumerism had come through. So consumer and customer activism was beginning to show up, and it's still evolving, but for sure, the post-internet world and the smart mobile device world is creating much greater empowerment in terms of giving consumers a voice. By the late 80s, early 90s, we were starting to see shareholder activism, where people took stakes in companies and said, we will influence what markets you enter, how you pay your staff, how you pay your management, what the remuneration process will be, what the pricing and even the quality processes would be. And of late, we're seeing something that is even newer, particularly over the last decade or so, which is employee activism, right? You get walkouts, and these are not union strikes. These are employees standing up and saying, we don't like what our company is doing, right? And there are so by the time you put that into context, firms have to care, because there is now activism across multi-stakeholder environments right across the spectrum, right? We used to talk about having to deal with multiple stakeholders rather than just shareholders, but now firms are in an environment where employee, customer, shareholder, government, for that matter, social participant, who's none of these. The society in which the institution is embedded has an ability to influence the direction of that institution. So that's the sort of the basic context in building bridge to turn around and say, institutions need to be aware, enterprise needs to be aware, industry needs to be aware. I then find the entire concept of industry very useful in saying, studying learning how to fix the problems of the world by studying the web and understanding that this has to be done across disciplines that are not necessarily mathematical or STEM, but really need to care about the social and environmental context they're in. That too is something that is showing up much more within industry. Over the last 10 years or so, to take a specific data point, if last year I could have said there were 3.7 million indices that people use in order to determine how to invest in industry, 1% of those 3.7 indices are environmental, social, and governance. Okay? But that 1% is growing at 60% per annum whereas indices in general, because we're all becoming sensors and actuators of data, is growing at about 11 or 12%. So there is a much greater focus on the data that says, are you behaving yourself? And this ranges from easily measurable things like gender diversity on a board or carbon emissions, through to much more sort of esoteric aspects of what constitutes the behavior of a firm, which includes things like, are you seen to be controversial in terms of the threat you place upon the environment? And are there proxies to be able to measure that to say, is your industry structure attracting fines? If so, what fines have been paid and for what? And if you look at the new generations coming through, the ESG element is going to become more and more important. So you then start seeing that an industry, a participant in industry, is just a microcosm of things that you would study and have to deal with when you're in web science in general. But with this populism meets stakeholder activism at multiple levels, attached to social governance and environmental factors really affecting how a firm works, the breakup of the traditional contract of work, which means it's a lot harder for firms to be able to attract and retain the people they want to attract and retain, because ethical basis for that have become more important. Then I'm sort of driving, I hope, into a framework where you can see quite readily that institutions have to really care. Business, industry has to really care about the things that you're here and have been listening to and expect to participate in for the rest of the week. So it's not, hey, JP's a good guy, he's retired, yank him along, he might have something interesting to say. But this is material to what you guys are doing right now. Now, in a firm, the biggest challenge to deal with anything to do with data is culture. Because the cultural environment, I've spoken about this before, but I'll be very brief, is for most of the history of firms, it has been a trust level to do with data of mother's home cooking. You knew where the data came from, who touched it, what recipes were used to be able to aggregate it, manipulate it, deal with it in any form. Labeling was consistent, and the environment in which the reports and inquiries came up was in your basement because there was very high control. So it was like the kitchen at home. Very high trust in the outputs because it was a very controlled environment where the inputs and the process were understood and the people were trusted. As you move out of that environment into one with firewalls and outsourced partners and smart mobile devices and the web at large, we now have information that is used to make decisions in firms, where trusting that information with the same level of trust as you would in the late 60s or early 70s is fundamentally saying you're comfortable with having street food with no knowledge of what's in it, where it came from, who produced it, while being blindfolded, and you start wondering why you're ill. So there is a huge cultural job to be done to be able to teach people within industry not to have those trust levels, to learn how to have discernment about truth, right? And that starts saying, well, data needs to have disciplines. And the disciplines are, to begin with, are pretty much like an ABC, right? Most firms go through a 4-stage process of dealing with data. First is you're only looking back, you're recording what happened. And the technical way, it's not even technical, people always like jargon for it, so you're in the descriptive phase of data because all you're doing is recording what happened. And in theory, you're meant to be able to say once scientific method regurgitated to deal with data in an enterprise, you say the next thing you do is you diagnose that data to try and form a model of what happened. And then you're able to predict with new variables because that diagnostic set has allowed you to build a model, and you iterate that model. And finally, you can prescribe what kind of action the board or the executive needs to take. So people go through this sort of DDPP, describe, diagnose, predict, prescribe, as if it's all as as easy as a PowerPoint slide, and you act like that. Then you find out some of the other things that Susan was referring to, which is actually the whole process of being able to collect that data, to be able to store it, to be able to diagnose it, is very frail, because it is very based on the local context and environment, the social values and norms, the way people think about what it is they're doing with the data and what else is affecting their life. So data is actually very local, even though firms may think they're global. And then you start making extreme mistakes of aggregating that data without any knowledge of the taxonomy or ontology, because those are, again, not skills that people have had. You have no idea that in location X it's collected once a year, in location Y it's collected once a day, because those were the practices based on what the local context felt was important. But because you don't see all that metadata and on the underpinning of the data culture those people have, you start adding apples to oranges or whatever else, and forget produce of more than one country or produce of more than one fruit. You've actually got rubbish. Okay? And you have a lot of that influencing and making decisions. And I'm not even going close to thinking about AI in the context of such poor data discipline. But again, when it comes to bridging between data science in a company and website, it's not that everyone's stupid in industry and that people can't figure out, well, we're going to have to go back to basics and understand something about immutability in a database. We need to know much more about the context within which the data was collected, how it was collected, and be able to embed that as part of the metadata so that we can solve for that more easily, where we have some idea of the archival methods and what kind of time series we would have, how the data is being kept fresh, and how long we would actually store the data. And if there are changes in structure or constituency of what we're dealing with, those changes are understood so that backtesting and stress testing in order to be able to deal with the models. Companies do this. They're not sort of wandering around saying that's for academia to solve. But academia tend to solve these things with very different constraints. In a company, it's I'm only solving things that someone thinks is a real problem that's going to pay me off with an internal rate of return of X. We don't spend our time writing bid report, what do you call your process of going for grants, the bid report or whatever it is. Instead of that, we're putting project, funding requests in, but it's the same thing, just in a slightly different set of constraints. And most of the time, nobody in industry is able to think long-term, probably beyond 3 months, even if they claim a year. So the cadence of how decisions are taken, where the decision rights are embedded, the concept of actually collaborating, again, Susan mentioned the surprise when looking at a set of books within a particular social context that these people aren't talking to each other. Saying, at least it was surprising because they could have and they should have. But in industry, it's more likely to be the answer they won't and they shan't and they would never consider it. So we're also looking at an environment where collaboration is almost frowned upon at market level, and there is huge waste associated with the lack of collaboration. So the next stage that happens is you start wanting to help industry, or at least part of why I got involved in web science was to try and see how could I get that flow between industry and academia, to turn around and say, there is a lot that has been learned about provenance within the environment of web science meets data science, because to me, it's still data science. The web just talks about a networked environment with far larger quanta of data being generated. But the skills and the techniques needed, the disciplines needed, all start saying, okay, well, there is something to be learnt about provenance. And it's as important inside the reporting function of a firm as it is from a news environment. To me, news is a subset of data. Okay? I have to think of it as that, meaning, I wouldn't use terms like corroboration in the same way as a journalist might, but I still think, when you don't have adequate confidence that a data source is correct, you look for other sources to validate that. I mean, even the peer reviewing process is a corroborating process, right? But it's there only because you need to look for other sources to be able to validate. Then the immutability element, we speak about things like deepfake and fake news, but it as much exists within an institution, right? When I was much younger, I used to be shocked at saying, so you saw it in PowerPoint or you saw it in an Excel spreadsheet and suddenly it became true, right? Where was your judgment in saying, this is just someone's, they've got edit rights on something they never used to have edit rights before. Yeah, in the past, when I saw a report coming out of a finance department, I knew that to be not necessarily the truth, but at least as close to the truth as we could have had with the conventions for recording in place and the proxies for measurement in place. And I knew the assumptions that made them. But in a completely distributed environment with edit rights embedded through, you have a very, very different problem to solve, because people are able to edit in order to satisfy their version of the truth. And then you have to aggregate it in a firm. Now again, when Susan was talking about healthcare and AI being applicable to a lot of that, you also have to wonder, I've got, I don't know, a couple of $100,000 worth of equipment inside me, okay? And I'm allowed to read what's on my pacemaker on steroids. I've got a defibrillator built in and miles of wires, and but for some reason they wouldn't let me edit anything on that device. Okay? I have no idea why, but I can query it, but I'm not allowed to play with it. Okay? But in an industry, all over the place, people are allowed to play with the very data that is part of their environment. Now you go back to almost any industry, whether it's, healthcare is just an example, food's just an example, nutrition is just an example. Say, how many edit rights do you actually have for the flow of that data before you aggregate it and send it for, some form of machine learning? Because to me, I'm still using all statistical kind of things, saying, whenever I look at something, the first thing I want to know is classify it to say, does it belong to a set I'm aware of? Why does it belong to it? And within that set, why is it different from others? Right? That's sort of almost the first set of questions I'm asked. Is it part of this? And if so, how do I know it's different from the others? And a lot of my work used to be just answering that question. This thing I've just seen, what is it part of? It's an entity resolution kind of element, but it informs many other things. But if I start assuming I have no idea about the immutability of what I'm seeing, it's not describing an event that took place because there are many other fingers that have touched it along the way. And then you start looking into that and saying, oops, there are industries within industry of people whose sole job is to edit the data flows. Right? Their lives depend on it. They wake up, they go to work, and they adjust. And which means that you have a new problem culturally to saying, if you're really going to solve for this, you need to protect this immutability. Right? Deal with problems of data at the source that the data came from. Do not try to edit it downstream because it's not reversible. You have lost a lot of value in doing just what you did because we forget signal versus noise. You just created an environment where you can do nothing with the data. But there is a natural inclination to say, if I've seen something wrong, let me edit it wherever in the process I'm at. Okay? And I'm not speaking for just the institutions I've been part of. I'm saying that is effectively, see there, so thank you for Cecil. But the the effect of our all having devices in our hands and on our desktops prior to that, and having edit rights to do with the things that would have been snapshots of events in the past, actually starts influencing our ability to get value out of what we are recording, because we do not know whether they actually reflect the event in its original state. Right? Now, obviously, the metadata correctly collected would allow us to see that there's, say, a time delta and a place delta. Right? But it makes me sound as if I'm all doom and gloom and negative about data, which I'm not. Right? I've spent my life with it. All I wanted to start asserting is a series of tools from how you store the data and understand the context, the social context in which the collection was done, impressing the tools and support needed for being able to prove mutability. It's like, this has not been photoshopped kind of thing, through to the provenance from there, because there is a flow, a journey that data takes place, and you need to show the lineage, again using the data sort of professionals term for it. But all you're trying to say is, hey, this train left the station, everything was locked when it left the station, and when it got here, nothing was changed. Then you start dealing with problems of aggregation, because even though there is a loss of information in the process of aggregation, most institutions need to summarize what they're doing. There are windows in time, whether they're to end of day or end of week or end of accounting period or whatever, where you need to have snapshots. And in a lot of those snapshots, you're going through some set of transformations because you're aggregating with some conventions and some assumptions. Right? So taxonomy and ontology and the disciplines to do with that become much more important. The labeling. Now suddenly, connected to web science, but more closely related with pure open data practices, the value that comes from being able to have common terms across an industry and make sure that those terms are adhered to. It's culturally no different from saying you say tomato, I say tomato, and I need to have a bridge to be able to connect with that. As soon as you have an institution that goes beyond a single narrow linguistic domain within which the data collection is taken. Right? It's like saying when you see, some ways of looking at data, it's saying you start off with a number, and that number doesn't mean anything unless you know what base that number was actually collected or reflected in. Right? If you know the base, then you have to start knowing something. The next thing that starts lighting up the data is knowledge of time and place that element of data was collected in. And one of the big reasons why we had what became a big data explosion and then led to machine learning and AI conversation was that the cost of associating a piece of data with date and time dropped alarmingly in the early 80s. Right? Suddenly with GPS and with access to the sort of the RTC of the device, you were able to have the metadata of time and place, and suddenly large data sets that you had no way of joining in the past began to be joined. You started having a proxy for identity, whether it was the SIM card or the person's logging to some service or the other. And all these were imperfect. People don't realize even UTC isn't UTC. It's an average of 78 different sources or whatever. I think 78 was the last number I looked at. So clocks aren't synchronized. There is a business in just synchronizing clocks. And particularly when you come down to things like microsecond level. Identity is becoming more probabilistic than deterministic. But nevertheless, we are getting to a point where we're saying date, time, and some proxy for identity is part of how that data gets lit up and starts getting valuable. When you start aggregating all that, again, the web scientist has a lot to be able to teach industry, but industry has the value of having sort of tiny, well-constrained Petri dishes to say, by the way, this is what we tried, we have the money to do it, and this is what we learned. And so an exchange of that kind of experience could become very valuable. How am I doing on time?
It's 2 o'clock now, so another 5 minutes?
Perfect.
Okay.
Right? So, what I'm trying to do is build a story that shows to you that industry faces the same issues as society in general. Industry has a right to be a participant within that society. The constraints as well as the benefits of saying smaller pieces, more loosely joined, with the ability to fund in shorter time experiments will allow learning to take place. And if there was the right sort of almost movement through semi-permeable membranes of exchanges of learning, we could get to a point where industry is able to accelerate what web scientists are learning and solving at scale across multiple cultures and time domains, and industry is also able to teach in a way by saying we have much smaller, well-contained experiments, and these were the things we learned. Right? People may not all like the use of the term experiment in this, but from a data science perspective, I'm very comfortable with being able to say that's what happens. And then you come towards the end of that sort of spectrum of saying, okay, you've collected the data, you're better at it, you've solved immutability, provenance, lineage, you've dealt with how you can have better answers on aggregation, the taxonomy and ontology have been solved. What happens next? And in the what happens next, we're very closely into the social construct of where all this is to be used. Should we be collecting that data? Is that data being used fit for purpose? Was consent actually gained for the use of that data? Where is the public good versus private harm tension in the use of that data? At which point should we be archiving that data? When should it be deleted? When should it be made available to law enforcement or to state actors? When should it not be? All these questions start coming about. Once you've solved almost like the data 101 of industry, and industry is facing that right now. Questions about the ethical use of data, what was, say, data protection regulation in the early 90s, coming through to a GDPR type construct. And obviously, every time a regulation comes out, it's going to be imperfect. It's like any other regulation, there'll be an iteration, there will be unintended consequences, there will be learning. But the point is that the protection that starts coming from saying, no, if you're not the customer, you're the product, your data is being used, we have to learn about how to do it better. Right? I wake up and go to sleep every day saying every human being and beyond is becoming a sensor and actuator of data. As sensors of data, if we are responsible with it, and I go back to Susan's responsibility sort of reference, we're able to come up with information about, just for one thing, waste. And if we can start reducing waste within this environment, we're able to start supporting not necessarily the creation of UBI at the kind of levels we want, but we're starting to extract social value that can be shared. I mean, the best example I know, it's again a very small one, but I wanted to share it and I'll close with that, was I heard about this woman who, born and brought up in India, went to the US to study, got disillusioned with what she saw there, went back to India, went back to her roots where her family came from, not the city she grew up in, and found that the shocking problem in the villages that she visited, which were her roots maybe centuries ago, I don't have all the facts, was water. The inability to predict the availability of clean water and how it affected their nutrition, their sanitation, their hygiene. It was hell for them. She tried to investigate why, and it turned out that the infrastructure of delivering the water to these villages was very old, breaking all over the place, and the leaks and the randomness of the leaks made it difficult to predict when the water will be available. You can't manage your day if you don't know when you have any water. And so she thought about it, looked at what was happening, went to the utility company and said, let me do a trade with you. I'll get all the people in these villages to SMS you when they spot a leak with a photograph of the leak, where it is. In exchange, you guarantee that each of these 5 villages will get 2 hours of water at fixed times that you tell them, even if you only tell them the day in advance. And suddenly, the collective of the sensors was passing information back to the utility that allowed them to deal with leaks more effectively, which raised the amount of water availability, that allowed more predictability in the delivery of that water. Okay? That's a single, very discrete example, but where I was trying to go with it is, there's a lot that can be done because we have the ability to sense data and to use it. In its use, there's a lot that we're still learning about how to be fair and ethical and right about it, and the public good versus private harm kind of tensions. But industry is not some sort of criminal on the side or a profit motive oriented element to be left alone. Industry is very much part of society. The activism that we see now and the growth of ESG means that industry will take this seriously. And the web scientists and the data scientists within that have a key role to play in being able to take macro learnings and have them applied in micro environments, and a little bit of the other way back, where the outputs from the micro experiments, for want of a better word, will help inform the academics at the macro element. And if that exchange can be made fairly, it becomes valuable. I hope that's useful. Thank you for your time. I'm open to questions.
Has anyone got the microphone? Microphone. Thank you very much, JP. In fact, funnily enough, at lunch, a few of us were talking about the artificial divisions between industry and business and academia, and the need for much more engagement and intercommunication between the two. And I totally agree with your argument that industry has a huge amount at stake in this field, and a huge amount of expertise that can help both advise academia and stimulate really interesting and important conversations between academia and industry. So I think the way that you opened all that up was really thought-provoking. Thank you very much. Any questions and comments for JP, just very broadly about this whole area?
Stunned you to silence.
Maybe you can ask us a question.
Well, Les is going to kick off.
You talked about data pipelines and sort of the usability of data and whether it's fit for purpose and where it comes from, and the different regimes under which it is collected. It just seems to me that data, we've always been struggling with it for one reason or another. If not for technical reasons, it's about legitimate ownership and whether we actually know what legitimate ownership is, or whether we're frightened to find out, or we assume that that there is some kind of intellectual property attached to it, for which we do or don't have the rights, and that's caused huge battles. And now GDPR has caused different sorts of battles. Can you imagine, given your experience, can you imagine a non-combative engagement over data, one that's much more naturally easy to to get all parties agreeing about? Is there a way that you see a way of talking about value, or some kind of narrative, some kind of idea that will make people want to collaborate rather than pull away from it for one reason or another?
Well, I'm a data optimist in that sense. Okay, while there may be a lot of misuse of data, when I look at my children and how they use it, And even today, people my age, there was a guy who wrote in Facebook, he's in the same industry, and he said, "Thank you everybody for your birthday wishes. However, it's not my birthday, it's just my Facebook birthday." And so the idea that people spoof their location, their identity, their birthday, even the time of day, and that there are ways around a lot of the barriers that we've been building for usually the wrong commercial purpose. That's very broken down. If you take my Amazon account, my whole family, including my grandchildren, use it. So the composite that person represents, goes from nappies through High School Musical through to the kind of stuff I buy. So, what sense is that if they actually think that's a person? The way I look at it, when I mentioned that data goes from number through time metadata, place metadata, identity, then the group, the rel graph of the person, through to industry labeling, SKUs, part numbers, generic names for pharmaceuticals, you name it. We have to try and make sure that these describers are kept out of the proprietary domain. Right? If the metadata is for things that you want to associate with the data, is kept free. So that, like if I take someone like the airline industry, right? The way the airport codes from 1937, not the 1974, 4-character things nobody uses, the way they were made free to air allowed an industry to form around travel. Because all you needed was access to the schedules, which was like Nigel talking about bus timetables. Okay? The generative ability of an industry to grow, if you say your road, street, avenue, time of day, the postcodes, zip codes, etc. Don't make those things proprietary. As soon as you do that, you're creating a monopoly that will constrain, the evolution of that industry. And a mix of the learning that comes from web science and that subset of open data, informing people that it's really important that this labeling capacity is kept free, will go a long way for people to being able to get the learning, because the data set joining becomes useful. Okay? Now it's that same data set where you have to learn where the controls are, because all the arguments about privacy to do with mail or communications or travel, a lot of it impinges not on the embedded data within the message, but the so-called lack of signal if you only have access to metadata, when we all know it's not true. Right? There is richness in that knowledge of context. And we have to learn how to manage that securely. Anyone who doesn't want to participate in the social web, so saying, well, take your phone and switch off anything that looks like connecting time or place, and you've already sort of kneecapped an entire industry, because those two things are very important in being able to join. And if you spoof it, you make it even worse, because you're able to suggest you're in a context you're not. So, and I would say two things. On the one hand, we have to collectively keep fighting to say no, generic pharmaceutical labels should never be proprietary. Food labels in this form should never be. Every industry come up with your equivalent of the SKUs, the part numbers, the stock codes, whatever, and give it. And there is a central place. It used to be that ISO or BS actually had standards institutions that maintained those. But we've moved into an environment where people aren't arguing about ownership of that well enough.
Because the data is their capital, isn't it? So, for many large corporations, the data they hold is a very, very valuable resource. And arguing that they should be much more collaborative and share their data, it could be a massive step forward in what you could do with that data and the predictions you could make with the data, but it's changing a kind of culture
Yeah, but-
where the data is, you know, they see it as something that belongs to them and is a valuable resource.
I think institutions have largely been very careful about having anything that looks like the value of data on their balance sheet. Because as soon as you do that, then every customer turn around and say, I want my slice of that value.
Yeah.
Okay? So data doesn't actually appear,
No.
right,
Okay.
as
Yeah.
capital
Yes.
that you would see on a balance sheet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? But people recognize that data has, information is power, is closer to where they've got. But the collaborative aspect is much more saying part of this activism I spoke about. Right? As soon as you say it's about the consumer and not the provider, and you have to, the trouble is the Industrial Revolution was all supply side. Okay, power was, the Industrial Revolution was about saying I'll take steam, I'll take power, I'll take steel, and I will manufacture things more cheaply. And then you have to have an industry of raising demand to meet that manufacturing capacity. And then when we all got empowered, rather than say, life is going to be made easier for us to find things, which is what search should have done. Somehow the search business model got inverted to becoming easier for the product to find us. Okay? It should have been about us finding product. Because that didn't happen, we now have some sort of anomalies to deal with. But companies will be willing. When I was at Salesforce, there were a lot of companies who particularly didn't want to have credit card information on their sort of tech estate, because as soon as they did that, they would become more vulnerable to loss of value in attack. So if a cyber attack took place, it is better to have nothing in the house that someone would want to steal. So you start seeing concentration saying, I'm a payment services provider, that's all I do. And it's natural to say, I'm an identity service provider, that's all I do, and we will somehow federate those rights. So things like self-sovereign identity is coming through with the blockchain kind of environment. How are ways to take that risk away? So corporations, particularly in a post-GDPR world, as cyber terrorism reaches the kind of levels that it has, don't want to hold things that make them vulnerable. Because now suddenly it's not an asset, it's a liability with huge fines if you get it even partly wrong. And you're going to get it partly wrong. So it's much more saying, if we collaborated in these things, if we accepted that certain metadata would be served even by non-profits or in a more distributed manner, if we learned that certain things could not be held as proprietary, then we're building an industry model where some of the things that we do will get slower, because by definition, as you get the disaggregation of that data flow, you're going to put some friction into the process. But that slowness isn't necessarily, we're all just waiting faster. So like there is a slow food or a slow thinking process, slowing down some of the things rather than, who wants a real-time general ledger to the millisecond? And if you had it, what would you do with it? Okay, so there are times when we want to say, this is not a place where we need to take out waiting time. I love the idea of pregnant pauses, of sort of companionable silences, that human beings have rhythms and cadences where the gap is valuable, and we shouldn't panic about it. In a very similar way, the speed at which we go through life, it's okay if we find a better way that's a little slower. Fast is not always good. Sorry, I'm getting philosophical here.
No, it's really interesting because most of the discussion is that life is speeding up, everything's speeding up, AI is going to speed everything.
I am definitely not speeding.
Any
Anything else?
questions or comments or thoughts?
Was it useful?
Yeah, really.
Just look at body language, you don't have to wave or anything.
Yeah. No, I think we can see from the body language. It's giving everyone a lot to think about. But I think, yeah, collapsing these boundaries between industry and academia and public sector and charity sector, that's really important. And if AI does anything in that direction, then that's got to be a really good thing. So maybe at this point we'll move forward into the panel discussion. So Les and Megwai, if you want to take your seats, and also you, JP. So
You don't get rid of me that
you
easy.
don't get rid of, yes. I'm not going to introduce everybody because I'm going to leave it to them to introduce themselves as part of their initial kind of introduction to you. I'm going to ask the panel to come back now to the topic of the day, which is AI for Future Society. And obviously we've had two very stimulating and thought-provoking lectures. So could I ask each person to just sort of shoot the breeze, talk for about 5 minutes on your views, opinions, state of the moment in terms of AI for future society. What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? Where's it going? What are the key questions? And if we can kind of pull together all the key questions that kind of emerge and throw them out. And I really want it to kind of be a bit of a debate, so rather than kind of them and us, let's have a panel discussion to use to kickstart just, you know, sort of debate, comments, responses, any thoughts flung out, very informal, but, you know, let's use what we've heard so far and what's going to come through the panel discussion to open up the floor. So, Niranjan, do you want to start?
Okay, so I'm the wrong person to start with. So, my name is Mahesan Niranjan. I call myself Niranjan for all purposes. I work in the CS department here, or Electronics and Computer Science CS department here. My research area is machine learning. I started as an electronics engineer, migrated into machine learning in general. I work with machine translation. I work with problems like computer vision. And more recently, my primary hands-on interest is in biology. Questions posed by large amounts of biological data coming from the time of the genome sequencing, 15 years ago. I teach machine learning here. We teach, me and 2-3 colleagues in the subject, we teach between us about 4 courses on machine learning, foundations, advanced, deep learning, reinforcement learning. There are also 2 very applied modules we teach on computational finance and computational biology. The shift towards taking these courses is massive at the moment. So 3 semesters in a row, I walk into a classroom. The classroom is so full, students sitting on their aisles and standing in the back. And I have developed this habit of taking a picture, of course with the consent of the students, emailing it to the director of programs in the first semester, the head of department in the second semester, the vice chancellor in the third semester, in order to get myself a bigger room to teach it. So I just want to say that the subject now is very, very popular. That's the first point. I'm standing in for Susan, so I do not know her well enough to imitate her, so I won't try that. By nature of my background and the fact that I work in the subject of machine learning, so anything I might say will have a bias towards that. So if I want to be controversial, I would say that under the umbrella of artificial intelligence right now, there is quite a lot of hype. And this hype is unjustified, it's just meaningless. We are confusing things about properly answering questions that are data-driven, like modeling, with automation. So you go past supermarket checkout, so you can now pay, do it yourself. Yeah. So that has displaced jobs. But this, I hate to call it artificial intelligence. Yeah. I hate even to call it intelligence. That's just plain vanilla automation. I would use intelligence or artificial intelligence in the context of a computer program with which I can beat the world's Go champion. There is learning, I think, involved because this AlphaGo program does it by self-play. So I set up the rules, I set up a powerful functional approximator. I know exactly what the statistical learning algorithms are. I know how to quantify them. And I let this play this out many times. And I have pulled out of it a mapping between the Go board position and what the best move might be, so that in the long term, statistically, this will win. Yeah. So to me, that's kind of at the intelligence end. Yeah. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I find it extremely difficult to define the word intelligence. What that means is I just have no chance of defining artificial intelligence. I might as well stick to machine learning, where I know precisely what I can do with my knowledge of statistics, functional approximation, dynamical systems, and parallel computing. So that's what I'm.
Right.
Can I pass?
Fine, yeah.
Yes.
Pass the baton.
Many of you have explained myself already. So I'll just say, so my background is that I've been a computer scientist. I was involved very early on in the web, and in that sense, in developing infrastructure so that what we'd previously done on individual computers with their small and limited capacity, we could now do across a network, and that our information stores and the kind of computations we did were working, were working to this new scale. And I've been particularly involved in something that is known in academia, open access, as well as the bigger topic of open data. So open access is about if you take the research industry, so if you take universities across the world, then how can they make their knowledge available to industry, to the public? And it's about looking at the mechanisms that we have for dissemination, and up to the point where the web came along, that was through a publishing industry, almost solely. And so we would publish things in journals, and there was some large business interests in creating these journals, and our knowledge going there. Of course, when you have the web, new kinds of publishing mechanisms come along. We were exploring something called open access. And my experience as a computer scientist was in building systems and platforms to allow knowledge and information to be disseminated like that. And it just happened to be research knowledge and the particular properties of it that we took advantage. What we discovered is that Tim Berners-Lee was wrong. In that in building the web, he said, information is just this abstract property, and sort of one of the principles of the web is you can give an identifier or a name to any knowledge resource you wish, and then you can use a particular protocol called HTTP to ask the internet to give you back this knowledge, this information, this resource. And what we discovered is that knowledge is not just an abstract resource. What it is it's owned by people. They invest their energy, their intellect, their effort in producing it, and it becomes a social issue. And that where we were expecting people to just sort of deposit their life's work into these information repositories, that was actually a very difficult ask. And also, there are big issues around the production and dissemination of information that come down to economic and political, the power plays in many ways. And so I realised as a computer scientist that I was only seeing a very small part of the problem. So that led me into the topic of web science, which is what I deal with. When it comes to the issue of AI, I think then we, as Narendra said, there is a lot of hype. I have sat in a meeting with leaders from the academic world and MPs. It was, in fact, on the 28th of March, the day before the original Brexit deadline, for those of you from the UK, and the MP was telling us not to worry. They were working hard to remove all of the uncertainty from the Brexit process for the university, so that was nice. And then an academic leader got up from one of the big technology organisations that advises UK universities and told us that we should all stop, that all of our students would soon be taught by, and I quote it here, all our students would be taught by machine learning before the decade was out, and that in fact our medical schools should stop teaching students about anatomy, because that would all be dealt with by computers, by AI in the next few years, and they should just teach doctors how to deliver people the bad news that they were ill that the computers had told them. And presumably the bad news that they were now going to be charged a fortune for using those computers, but nonetheless. However, so there are huge leaps of the imagination that we've seen before in different contexts when new technology becomes available. My own perspective, and I've mentioned this to some of you already, is that AI stands for advanced IT, and we are very bad at dealing with IT. We sell it as a product and then we install it, and our end user license agreements just say, this will do something, but please, we hold no responsibility for anything. And now we are building products that are actually starting to take on decision-making roles that we have previously assumed were going to be taken on by professionals. And our society has evolved and developed so that professionals who take on important roles and have responsibility exist in kind of professional associations with particular qualification requirements on them, with particular legal expectations about them, in organisations that have particular processes for mitigation against something going wrong. But when we just buy pieces of software and run them without thinking about these things in many cases. So we are just very bad at organising ourselves to make use of more capable IT at the moment, and that's one of the things that we really need to think about in the future.
Thank you, Les. JP, AI and future society.
Having spoken for quite a while, I'm going to be as brief as I can. I love Douglas Hofstadter's definition of AI. AI is everything that you don't know how to do. Because as soon as you know how to do it, everyone says that's not AI. I'm also very taken with one of the first statements I heard about statistics, which was all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. So there is a learning that takes place. But where I'm coming from about AI in society is that human beings have sensing apparatus, and our senses are optimized to do certain jobs, and our brains, in being able to take that which is sensed and make sense out of it, are also optimized in certain ways. Those optimizations have biases that could be cultural, social, contextual, even generational, which means we're good at getting signal out of what we sense, but not all the time. And we've been learning for a lot of time about psychological biases we have, and most of us know something about those biases and seek to correct them. What has happened is that by a veritable explosion in the number of things that can sense data, the quanta of data that we face and the context in which the data is being collected are way outside our human ability, because that's not what we're evolved to deal with. If we're going to make sense of that, it makes sense for us to build tools that can make sense of it. So I think of AI as that tool set, that we have an abundance of sensory data that we didn't used to have. We ourselves are not humanly evolved to that, because Kevin Kelly, who used to be one of the founding editors of Wired, he used to turn around and say technology has three reasons to exist. One is to, necessity is the mother of invention, to solve a given problem. The second, which is less common but pretty well understood, is to make use of an observed effect. What do you call it? Velcro is a classic example of observing an effect and then finding a use for it in society, saying, dog, burr, stream, high cohesion, loose coupling, no damage. Let me replicate that now. I have high cohesion, loose coupling in an artificial sense. But what Kevin used to say is that his most interesting view of technology is that it speeds up evolution. I could gain bulletproof skin through millennia of being shot, and over time I would get that. Or I could invent Kevlar. So I want to think of AI as a means of saying I could evolve to deal with these huge changes in the quanta of data generated, or I could build certain tools to solve that for me because it's too boring for me to do. Right? But I am still the master. So we have abundances in terms of data, we have scarcities that are socially meaningful, like privacy. We have these challenges of asymmetry between the public good and private harm, like with tracking the Ebola nurse. And that is going to become worse rather than better because we have sensing capacity everywhere. London has more sort of CCTV cameras than God. Those sort of environments, at which point does the surveillance society take over? Because sensing is just surveillance with a different name. If you have a bad actor being able to deal with what is sensed. So AI to me is the entire industry, the opportunity and the value of taking information at levels that we never had and that we didn't evolve to be able to process, and finding ways of solving that and extracting value for it. So it's the Kevlar for vast amounts of data.
Thank you. Right, I'd like to open things up now. You've heard a lot about the future and where we think AI might take us or not. And I'd like to open up and ask you, what scares you most about AI and what thrills you most about AI? What do you see is really exciting going forward? How much do you see life is going to change? Or does it fill you with dread? Does it fill you with a certain degree of anxiety or fear or destruction? You see that there's going to be destruction of some key aspects about your lifestyle and society that you care about. So let's just have some reflections, and then you can ask our panel to reflect on what you say, and you can reflect on what they say. So who's going to be brave? Go on.
That's brave. So, I was a teacher for 11 years.
Sounds like you have been brave.
And of course, there are huge questions about what is intelligence, what actually is it. There's been all sorts of methods put forward to try and measure it. IQ testing was the thing when I was a youngster and I had my IQ tested, but there have been other things. And there are different IQs as well, it's not just one test. So it's a very, very muddied area. And I have to, and on the one hand, I loathe the term artificial intelligence because we still don't know what intelligence really is. And so how we can begin to even think about AI, I find that difficult to comprehend. On the other hand, I am glad we're talking about it because of all the things it drives. So all the innovation and all the things that are behind it are being driven by artificial intelligence because that's a really nice buzzword, or words I should say, and it's very effective from that point of view. But when I started my PhD, I thought about, okay, artificial intelligence and machine learning, and over the course of 5 years I've actually completely turned around, and actually artificial intelligence and machine learning are not the excitement that they first were, because mostly what I see is machine learning is statistics. It's all based in statistics and probabilities, and programming machine learning to beat you at Go is, when you break it right down, I think, is a series of probabilities. What's the most likely move next that's going to achieve, that's going to allow me to win? And of course, people aren't like that. Or if they are, we haven't been able to pinpoint that. At the moment, people don't appear to be like that. People appear to be able to think almost randomly. Doctors will come to conclusions about what might be wrong with the patient in front of them that's not based on these are the symptoms and this is what it looks as if it's most likely to be. They might come up with a conclusion that is based on something that patient said to them a couple of visits ago that they've remembered. And suddenly they kind of put all the things together and a conclusion presents itself that you'd never in a million years come to, but something about what they know sparked them to say, maybe it's this, and they were right. But it was such an unusual thing that most people wouldn't have got there. And so I'm torn with AI. I like what it does. I like the conversations that it generates, and I like the innovation that it's driving. On the other hand, and that's from kind of this side of the desk, but when you're the other side, and people will say, oh, you study AI, and I would say, actually, I think there's still no such thing as AI. We're still in machine learning and statistics, and artificial intelligence has yet to arrive. We don't have it. When we'll get there,
Before I ask the panel to respond, I think let's get a few more comments and views, and then you can respond to kind of a cluster. So, yeah.
Optimistically, in terms of education, I think the education system we have at the moment is so heavily influenced by ancient monastic structures of learning that it's not suitable for today anyway. So I don't know what we're going to get in the future, but it's got to be, what we're using isn't that great. My big fear is that this whole data bubble, like data has a value. I know Susan's previous talk when she did the Excel, she did mention how there's this expectation that the big companies have to build, that there's value in data because all these billionaire fortunes are coming from it. My fear, I guess, is that there's going to be a realization that data is not as valuable as we thought, and a big crash or something like that, specific. And then it's similar to Sarah, like as a social scientist, I have no trouble doing statistics. Why can't I do machine learning? What is that barrier? What am I not? Why can I have no trouble doing statistics, and lots of my colleagues have no trouble doing statistics, and we've been trained in the social sciences, and why aren't we making that move into machine learning? What's that about?
Yeah.
I would like to add to some of the ideas that Sarah mentioned about intelligence. So I'm a neuroscientist by training, and from my perspective, everyone in my field seems to be using deep learning and machine learning to model the brain. So basically, simple models that we used to use have kind of approximated the data not as well as deep learning, but had some sort of grounded ideas behind it, are now replaced by this black box of, we can predict the data really, really well, but we have no idea what this deep neural network is doing. And I think that kind of reflects the
the idea that we can't really create intelligence, at least right now, because the brain is just so much more complicated and humans are so much more complicated. And it kind of, to me, it's a bit worrying that people just apply deep learning and machine learning to anything that they can think of, and that seems to be very much true in my field. Every talk that I saw in this conference in Brussels the other week had some sort of machine learning in it, because people feel like they need to put it in because they can. I don't think that's just true for neuroscience. I think that's true for a lot of things in the world right now.
Let's have a few responses to those comments and then we'll go back. Yeah.
So I'll start from the last one. So everyone should not include my students, okay, when they won't pass. And the reason I say that is the last 3 industrial consultings I did, I was approached by companies because they wanted deep learning. They approached the university's research arm, they put them in touch with them, and I worked with them 1 week each case. Each of the 3 problems was solved by simple logistic regression with some very clever tweaks that were based on that specific problem. Okay, the tweak is what I got paid for. Yeah. And it was a big mistake because I stopped in 5 days. I could easily have trained deep neural nets for them for 3 months and kept an income stream. So when I reported this at home, my wife said we were stupid. this could have happened. But yeah, so that's certainly true. When there is a hype, everyone wants to use all these techniques on these problems. So a problem that we're looking at very recently is a chemistry problem. Chemists make synthetic molecules. They want to know how much they will dissolve in water so that we can have make drugs out of them maybe and swallow them. So there is a data set which is released as a competition data set. So if you have an algorithm that predicts how soluble a molecule is, you can try on this, you can take part in this competition. The last 3 papers that came out of that using very high power machinery would compare that my method is slightly better than Less's method type results. But the difference between my method and Less's method is smaller than the accuracy with which you can measure how soluble a molecule is. Yeah. So that's the extreme to which you will go if you work with saying that here is data, here is my model, some magic should come at the other end. Yeah. And this just won't work. This is silly. Right? So that's the first point. There was the other is, of course, I agree. We are working with, and JP touched on this as well, with a term that we cannot properly define. So if a term we cannot properly define, then we can, of course, either use it to our advantage when it suits us, or be skeptical about this when it doesn't. This is fine. Where I draw the line, and I also change, we all change, so over time. So those days, if I wrote a computer program that will add 2 numbers, yeah, that's a program. And I would say intelligence is, yeah, well, can I do on a machine what I very naturally do? So very naturally do with my perceptual system, so recognize speech. So now we can build systems that can automatically type, understand, or recognize speech, but we know precisely every single component, what every single component does. So that's now not intelligence anymore. So in my scale, the Go playing program is still a little bit intelligent, yeah. But the chess playing program is not, because chess is done by brute force search. So I can build the search tree, I can search down, I get tired, the computer doesn't, so I can let it search and beat the chess champion. Go is slightly different, it's the pattern spotting. So similar to your doctor, I think, oh, there's something really cool going on there, because the clever Go player looks at the board and says how to move. There's no chance in hell of them searching, yeah, because the search tree grows very, very rapidly. Right? So similar to your appreciation of the doctor, I'm appreciative of the program that learns what the best move might be, that wins in the long term just by spotting from the current board position. So that's where my line is, yeah. But different people are free to draw the line wherever. Yeah. So at the other end, automation, supermarket checkout, I just don't care that that's intelligent or not. Voice recognition, I've given up on whether it's intelligent or not. Machine translation also I've given up whether it's intelligent or not, because I know precisely how I map the sentences into a mathematical space, how I learn a mapping, and how I translate back. I know exactly what's there. So yeah, so there was a nice point about education you said. I missed that. Whether
the word monastic.
Whether
Yes.
our techniques we use are suitable or not. I certainly think my role is changing over time. So, but not with AI or machine learning will replace me. It's more to do with how I interact with my students. So when I was at the same age as my students now, the only source of information to me was what the lecturer wrote on the board. The lecture comes right on the board, and some of them are so clever they could run as fast as they wrote, and you have to very quickly absorb that information. So now that information is available in 1,000 different places. So I don't want to be anymore the guy standing here supplying information to students. This is meaningless. So my style of teaching has completely changed. So I have 3-hour-long lab sessions to study machine learning. Students are given very challenging classes to do. There are optional exercises, there are exercises you have to do. There are, and they in a computer room of 150 students, and I have 13 demonstrators walking around and helping them solve these problems. The amount of information I transmit from the board, I have reduced dramatically. And even in that, when I change from, to go back to the monastic age, change from using slides and PowerPoints to writing on the board, my teaching valuation goes up. And that's kind of counterintuitive because the students didn't have to write down, so they learn a bit better. But that was 2 years ago. Now that has changed. When I write something on the board, they take pictures. So that's failing as well completely. Yeah, so we just have to adapt to the way students learn, the way we provide them with information. We also have, staying with teaching, even bigger challenges. Bigger challenges because our class sizes are big, I already mentioned this. But the classes, in terms of the backgrounds of students we take, are heavily bimodal, particularly when you teach mathematically heavy, statistically heavy subjects. So students, in the machine learning class, for example, that I'm going to start teaching in October, there will be 150 students, and I can bet, based on past experience, 10 students would have done the Stanford course on machine learning to completion, and they will ask me questions in class for which I do not have an immediate answer. I have to pause. There will be 25 students who have not seen linear algebra since high school. So we take them all into the same class, and I'm supposed to teach them. So how do I adapt to this? So this year I'm prepared. I've introduced 2 courses. So one is machine learning technologies, where they learn the techniques, the concepts, and hands-on programming experience. One is far more mathematical, where they learn the limits of these algorithms. How do you prove that something converges? How do you quantify how well it might perform on unseen data? That sort of concepts. So we just have to adapt very fast. At the undergraduate level, if you go back, there are far more serious problems because we mentioned society. My department's entry grade is A star to A. If we want to limit numbers, we should push it even higher. Immediately society comes to mind, and we cannot ignore the fact that if you ask for A star to A grades with mathematics as one subject, then we are recruiting students from a very narrow section of the society in this country. Yeah. My management is not sensitive to this. However many times I say this, I get ignored. Yeah. If I say a little bit strongly, then there is a backlash. There is a kickback, not kickback, backlash or a response to that. And this is just wrong. This is just wrong. So we have a strategy in our university of raising entry grades as a way of going up the league tables. Yeah, because your entry grade is a feature, there's a correlation between entry grades and the probability the student gets jobs, and you know why that is. Yeah? And so when we talk about teaching our subject in this context and society, wider society, we have a far bigger responsibility than the statistics that we teach or the machine learning that we teach. I think I'm drifting from the probably too much. Yeah.
it comes back to the question ultimately is who will be able to design AI, who will be able to design ML.
Yeah, so we
Because
cut
if you
out
haven't
more-
had access to going through the education and training, then
Right,
you're not
so-
going to be able to.
So by structure, we cut out vast sections of the society.
Yes.
But our senior management are correct to say, if you want to maintain a very high research base, then you've got to take students who only have A star to A, let's say that, yeah? But that A star to A is coming from something like 12% of the population, yeah? But there's no reason to believe that the mathematical ability that I need is restricted to 12% of the
Yeah,
population.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I've got to, so you're absolutely right.
Yes.
So your A and A star students isn't necessarily the best for,
Yeah,
for the skills that you're looking for.
It's-
And then if we widen, if we just kind of think of AI and
Yeah.
the other things that Susan was talking about this morning, you don't necessarily need somebody who's really, really good at maths. What we
No, I can
need
teach
are
that.
people that are good at maths, but are also prepared to consider all wider things. So
Even-
they're prepared
yeah.
they're prepared to look at how what they're doing impacts on people, how people impact on what they're doing, ethics, privacy, trust, all of those things.
Yes, I agree, but there is more that I'm looking at. What I'm looking at is not that the students outside my 12% are not capable of doing maths, they just didn't have the chance.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's the point, okay? And we have to be conscious of this, which we currently systematically, structurally are not.
Les,
Sorry, yeah,
any
sorry, yeah.
responses to?
Well, there's not much left in the good answer space. So I'll go with it. Yeah, you made the point that you really don't know what intelligence is, and therefore you hate the issue of artificial intelligence. What does it mean? What does it mean? And I was always struck by, and I can't remember who said this. Someone made the point that the question of can a computer really exhibit intelligence is no more interesting than the question of can a submarine really swim? You know,
Yeah.
it's just, you know, it does something useful. Whether you call it that, whether it's entirely equivalent to the human notion of swimming, that, you know, that's not really going to get you very far. So I think partially that, and there were a number of other things, really clever things I was going to say in response to your own, but I've just been blown away by that. So, can I pass on to
I'll be
JP,
very
and then
quick.
perhaps I'll come back to it.
I want to stay away from the academic side, because bring balance for different type into the thing, otherwise known as I'm stupid. But I was fascinated with understanding what a recapture did. Okay? So you're given an exercise, and you get a dozen photographs, and you're going to say, find the ones with cars or buses or traffic lights. And the reason you're doing it is because the machine can't do it. Sort of thing. Well, if that's the level machines are at right now, right? I have a long way to go before I start worrying about them, because my dog could do it and I don't have a dog. Okay? So just an instance, but the reason I bring that up is, you know, when you talk about the doctor, or when you talk about the failure of current education structure, etc., or when you talk about how everyone's putting, you know, AI in because it's like it's a magnet for funding and you've got to include it for whatever you do. In all of them, my interest is in saying the doctor who remembered something from 3 meetings ago or whatever, and somehow brings it to bear to make a decision. For me, the heart surgeon who's performing 25 operations a day, and how she is absorbing that learning to make it useful. Human beings don't scale well, right? We've got some extremes of performance, and we're not able to replicate that. Life would be a lot easier if we could find a way of replicating that, okay? When I was at BT, I used to look at engineers who would look at what the customer said and say immediately, that's not a technical or engineering problem, that's a billing problem, okay? because it was something in the way the fault was described. And it, you got to spend a lot of time before you figure out what was in that person's experience and makeup that allowed that sensing of saying, you guys are all wasting your time. This has gone to the chairman, this problem we can't fix. The guy just hasn't paid his bill. Okay? What was it in the description? So for me, the reason why I will still believe in the importance of artificial intelligence for society, and I bring in the ethics, the privacy, the need for it to be socially acceptable, is to say we have social problems today, the problems that society faces, where we have a very, very sparse human ability to solve it, but there is good practice showing up here and there. Is there a way of taking what they are sensing and responding and replicating that and scaling that up at an affordable level? And I'm stressing affordable, because if we can do that, then we're really going to make an impact on many things. And the number of times I've sat in front of an unusually gifted expert who listens to something I'm saying for 20 minutes and then says, this is the problem you need to solve. And I'm trying to say, I need to can that, I need to systematize that. And what we've got with this plethora of new data is that problem in spades, right? Where if we could get human beings to really do what they do well and learn how to replicate that. So for me, the machine learning class or the AI class, right? Half of the class is saying, no, I don't get out of bed to say, I have found a way of being the best at Go. Saying, great, why don't you tell me that you've invented a 140 character messaging mechanism and solved world peace through that? You've created, as far as I'm concerned, politicians who can hold sway over vast multitudes through that, and that's about all you've done. Right? I'm much more interested in saying, teach people how they can scale up the learning of the outliers of their particular specialization and do it in a way that everywhere in the world, because one of the advantages of a technology-driven digital environment where half the world may not am acutely aware of the digital divide, but I'm also aware when I go to India, everyone can make a phone call, even the sacred cow. It's affordable, it's cheap, and people are changing their lives with it. So let's take the momentum of that and let's find ways of solving real problems, and the health, wellness, nutrition environment appears to be the best place to start, because there are a lot, you can even think better if you've got some of those things resolved. There's something Maslowian about it. So it's not, all the VC money is going into medical, or the food industry has got the most powerful lobbies or whatever, but that there's genuine good that can come from it, and that good can free us up for solving many other things. But I've seen these specialists, I've seen enough of these experts, and they don't know how to articulate what it is they've learned. And I would much rather go around and say, I'm going to build this heart surgeon, right, who is capable of learning from 35, 40, 100 operations a day, and there's something, your pattern element underpinning the alpha. Okay? That sort of ability. And yes, we have lots to learn about privacy, about protecting the data, about avoiding misuse. But all of those, if you put the energy into saying, I'm not just getting better at learning, I'm doing it in the constrained worlds of where I've already seen human beings excel, but they are so rare that if I can multiply them out by giving other people that benefit, and these other people may have all the other social skills that, because some of the geniuses we know in almost every walk of life are flawed, okay? Part of the price of that genius is some Achilles heel of immense pain. Sort of saying, no, we'll take human beings. regular people that you want your children to grow up with, and then say, but we'll give you the tools. Okay?
Yeah.
And that can be done, and I'm going to stay utopian on it, believing that we'll keep learning, but it's not going to be, because money flows into where they can get better returns. It's actually about improving the quality of life.
Can I just come back on that? Yeah. So very very quick. So the thing about the web that really excited me was this ability that it gave us instantly for hugely improved recall. It made me better because I could remember things that I'd never learned. That I could very quickly get access to lots and lots of information, and that feels different now. It feels different. I don't have to be as ignorant about things. That if I want to, I can just look up something and it'll be there within a few seconds. Yeah. And I think for me, the thing that I get excited about these advances in machine learning, particularly, is that it's about a new. Again, it extends. As humans, we're very good at spotting patterns and seeing, sort of correlations between things. And part of our learning is to be able to do that, to develop the expertise, the experience, to train ourselves to be able to do that. And we have a certain facility within our brain. Some of it's in our motor system, some of it's in our visual system. But we do that. And this, the machine learning is the ability to spot patterns and correlations in hugely, enormous data sets with huge dimensionality that we wouldn't be able to see or understand or appreciate before. The reason that I think that we're not using this to its best ability at the moment, we haven't got used to it, we haven't designed and developed the tools that will be easy for us to do that. At the moment, basically, Python. You've got to learn how to do it in Python, and it's a long old slog. You need to do that. When we develop the machine learning equivalent of the spreadsheets, to help us to investigate these things, then I think we'll see a lot of advantage, a lot of benefit.
Well, I think those are messages of hope, actually. So on that note, those notes of hope and positivity with regard to AI, I think we ought to stop with a cup of tea. I think we're probably all ready for one. But let's hope that the discussion is going to carry on all week, because I think it's been an excellent start to really stimulating us into thinking about these broader issues in very wide-ranging and probably quite new directions for some of us. So I'd like to thank everybody on the panel and the speakers that we had this morning. And so thank you very much indeed.